Hello, I'm Sarah Woods, Director of the Kentucky Book Festival, a program of Kentucky Humanities. Welcome to the 2020 Kentucky Book Festival online. We're so glad you've joined us this evening for a special program and book festival that brings together authors, readers, and literary enthusiasts from across the country and the Commonwealth, just like we've done for 39 years. All of our Kentucky Book Festival conversations would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. Today, the Kim Edwards Charitable Foundation is bringing you Writing Historical Fiction. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this discussion with Roxana Robinson, Bobbie Ann Mason, and Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle, in conversation with author Margaret Verble. I've got Margaret sitting with me right here, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her before we get started. She is an enrolled and voting citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and a member of a large Cherokee family that has, through generations, made many contributions to the tribe's history and survival. Margaret's first novel, Maud's Line, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2016. Her most recent book is called Cherokee America. Margaret, would you tell us a little bit about your book before we get started?
Well, I guess you're asking about Cherokee America,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Well, it's set in Oklahoma, or in Indian Territory. It's set in the 1870s, and it's about a woman who was actually named Cherokee America, and about that whole community of Indians that were sitting out there in the Cherokee Nation.
Wow, okay. Well, it sounds fascinating. We are going to hear much more about Margaret's book as we move along. Are you ready to jump into conversation with our authors?
I certainly am.
Okay, all right. Let's get started. What's your first question?
Well, my first question actually is about how they choose subjects.
Okay.
Because one of these authors has written a novel set in the 1800s, and another one's written a novel set in the 1940s, and the other one's written a novel set in the 1960s. And they have, none of these novels have anything to do with each other.
Right.
But they're all historical fiction.
Right.
And so I wonder, how does a writer of historical fiction come to their subject?
Okay. We'll let one of the authors jump in here. Whoever wants to go first.
I don't mind going first. So my novel is set in 1942, and the setting actually chose the narrative in my situation, because my novel is set during World War II. It's the summer of 1942 specifically, when the Grove Park Inn, which is a upper class resort in Western North Carolina, in Asheville, North Carolina, they held access diplomats and foreign nationals as prisoners of war that summer. And when I found out about that, it was fascinating for me, because I've grown up in Western North Carolina, lived here my whole life, and had just recently heard about that history. And when I considered the proximity to the Qualla boundary, or Cherokee, North Carolina, it really allowed me to explore issues of identity and citizenship in America, and specifically the interaction of Cherokee people, Eastern Band Cherokee people, in a context where you have foreign nationals who are also diplomats being held as prisoners of war. And then you have my main character, for example, who goes to work at this resort that summer. You have him interacting with these foreign nationals and U.S. military. And it allowed me to have a conversation in the narrative about how we decide identity and belonging, and who has right to place. So to the question, how did I choose the subject? The setting, including the time period, very much set the tone for the narrative, and allowed me to kind of turn up the heat on these themes of identity, race, and culture that I wanted to explore.
Okay, can we hear from one of our other writers now? Roxanne, are you
Okay.
out there somewhere?
Sure. I will tell you why. I mean, the subject of my book, my most recent book, Dawsons Fault, which is the first time I've ever done an historical work, the subject is my great-grandparents, and they lived in Charleston, South Carolina after the Civil War. And my great-grandfather spent the rest of his life there. My great-grandmother died in Paris. But I became really interested in them sort of in a fluky way. Dawson, my great-grandfather, was well known in Charleston. He was a liberal newspaper editor for the Charleston. He started the Charleston News and Courier. And so he was a curious character. He was English and came to this country to fight for the South in the Civil War. But he came from such a different background from that of all his friends in the Confederate Army that he ended up by disagreeing with a lot of them when he became the editor. He did not come from a background that supported slavery. He came from he was a Catholic. He did not believe in violence. He refused to carry a gun. He tried to ban lynching. He did ban dueling. So, and because he was a newspaper editor, his voice was very well known. So he was kind of a paradoxical character, and I became more and more, and he was also part of a very, very melodramatic story. And I became more and more interested in him because I grew up in New England, really, and my great aunt is Harriet Beecher Stowe. So I always thought I identified with the New England part of my family, but I became more and more interested in him. And as I did the research on that period from 1860s to 1880s, it became more and more powerful. This was the time after Reconstruction called Redemption, when there was suppression of the Black freedmen's votes, their rights, and their votes were suppressed and their rights were suppressed. And as I did the research, it took 5 years, the topic became more and more contemporary, and I realized I was writing about not just my family, but my country.
Okay, thank you. Bobbie Ann, are you out there? I thought I was going to be able to see you all, and I can't see you, but I bet you're there, aren't you, Bobbie Ann?
Oh, thank you. I'm rather astonished that you asked me to talk about a historical novel. This takes place mostly in the 60s, so that doesn't seem so long ago to me. And the novel Dear Anne, there are a lot of letters in it starting Dear Anne, and so that's why I called it Dear Anne. A woman named Anne is on a cruise ship in 2017, and she's looking back on her life 50 years before, and starting with the Summer of Love in San Francisco. So she is looking back on her memories, but what she's trying to do is to rewrite them, to imagine a different story, and to imagine that it didn't happen in upstate New York, but rather it happened in California. She thinks, wouldn't it have been exciting to have gone to California instead of the East Coast? And so her motives for doing this, for trying to get away from what actually happened, are what make the conflict between her memory and her imagination. And I thought that was fun to explore. It's kind of complicated, and there are different levels in which she remembers and imagines. And so there's a story within a story, her past life and her present. And it takes place in her imagination at Stanford University. Um, and you see how she can't keep her actual memories away from this new story she's telling herself. Um, so that's the basis of the novel, and it it's drawn from a lot of different inspirations and sources, but I didn't think of it as a historical novel when I was putting it together. I thought it was like yesterday.
Well, I want to say that I actually resent it being called a historical novel because I can remember what you were writing about happening. And that leads me sort of into asking you, let me start with you, Bobbie Ann. Is it hard when you write about things that people live through that are, and people who are still alive, or at least I was alive this morning, I'm wilting as the day goes on. Do you find it harder to write for an audience that has some knowledge, really firsthand knowledge about what you're writing about?
When they, I'm sorry, I missed that. When the readers have knowledge of what you're writing about.
When the readers have firsthand knowledge of what you're writing about.
Well, they will have their own versions. I wanted to write something that wasn't filled with cliches about that particular time. With the Vietnam War going on, 1967 was a memorable year, and every time there's a documentary about the 60s, there are all these images from that year, and they're all the same ones. I wanted to come at it from a different angle from what I've read. I wanted to write about what it was like to be a student at that time. Usually, I don't think I've ever read anything from that point of view, and yet the students were in the forefront of what was going on and the protests and the unrest on campus because of the looming draft. So I wanted to write kind of a romantic story, a story that could exist even without a lot of those iconic images. I wanted to write about the innocence of the kids in college then, and how they were. My memory and my experience of that time was that everybody was mixed up and scared and didn't know what to do, and they were experimenting with relationships and dabbling in experimental new things, and there were things that set them loose, but fundamentally underneath all the change was young people trying to find somebody to love. And so I wanted to make a real story and not just have all the issues of the day take the forefront.
Mm-hmm. And you did a good job of it too. Although I have to say that the section on Sergeant Pepper's of the album coming back, I felt like that you're writing about my own life there.
Well, I was.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
I thought, oh my God, you've absolutely captured.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to emphasize. The Sergeant Pepper album, I wanted just to convey what it was like at the first week in June 1967 when that album came out.
Oh, yeah.
Because it doesn't leave you. And it was played everywhere. You heard it everywhere, and it meant something different to everybody, but it just emerged like an answer to everybody's problems.
It certainly did. I felt exactly the same way that you felt about it, or that you portrayed there. Let me move on to, you were talking about innocence and young love and that kind of thing. And Annette, that takes me to your characters. They are, you have an innocent young man who is your major character, and he does fall in love. And is the telling of that love story, was that an important part of that novel to you? Because you didn't mention that as you were talking about it initially.
Right. I don't think I set out necessarily to write a love story. It wasn't my primary focus when I started kind of laying out the novel in my head. But what I did want to convey was a discussion about how we label everything. We label all kinds of identity, including relationships. And so as my characters were developing, my protagonist County, and then this character of Essie, who is a young Cherokee woman who goes with County to also work at the Grove Park Inn. As they were developing, it occurred to me that that they would have a special relationship because they are the two people who are coming from this community into a totally different environment, and it would be natural for them to develop some kind of relationship. But I wanted to be careful. Bobbie Ann was talking about not being cliche about what is expected, and I think after talking to some readers, they expected the typical romance to bloom when you have two characters spending that much time together. So it then became central to the story that I explore their relationship without labeling it like we would a typical relationship. It's a different kind of, the closest word is a friendship, but it's a deeper kind of friendship, and they connect in a secret room at the inn, room 447, and develop their own culture within that room. And that was far more important to me than to tell a traditional love story. I wanted to talk about how two human beings have a common background and can how that carries over into a new environment.
Okay, good. Let me bring Roxana in here. And Roxana, I know the love story between your major character and his wife is not the focus of your book, but as I was reading it, one of the things that I was curious about is, what's it like to write about the sex life and love life of your great grandparents?
Yeah, so it's weird. I mean, as I say, that it's the first time I've done something like this. Although it's not entirely true, because I wrote the biography of Georgia O'Keeffe, and so for that book, I had to enter into somebody else's life, a real person, and I had to try to give her a voice that was based on everything I knew about her. So I was doing that in this as well. I had there's so many archival sources for this book. There are letters to different family members. There are letters between Dawson and his wife. So I had a very clear sense of the words they used and the feelings that they had for each other. At one point, Dawson writes to her when he's trying to persuade her to marry him, and he says, "Why does my hand tremble so when I write to you?" So their words were so moving that's one reason I used their words often instead of my own, because I felt as if I was giving them short shrift if I was trying to paraphrase their words, which were very good. So in some ways I felt as though these were not my family. These were people that I had come to know. And then in some ways I already knew them, because there were so many moments in which I felt part of the culture that these characters were part of. Sarah was a gardener. One of the things that one of their sons wrote and said that Dawson, his father, would go to a concert or the opera, and he'd come home afterwards and he'd sit down at the piano and he'd play the music he'd heard, even if he'd never heard it before. And that's what my father did. He would come home and sit down at the piano and play things by ear. So when I read that, I thought, this is so interesting, the way we all are part of braids that make up our families, and we may not even know it. We don't know that that's what our great grandfather did, but it's part of our own knowledge. So in some ways I was writing about strangers, and in some ways I was writing about people that I was part of. So it was strange. There were moments when I thought, I don't really have the right to say this, and moments when I thought, I have to say this. I have to say this. It's important.
Well, you brought up here something that I want to ask all three of you about, and that is, in writing historical fiction, of course, we're looking at primary and secondary sources all the time, and it's I don't know where I'm supposed to look now. They thought they were going to be over here, and now they're over here. We're looking at primary and secondary sources, and Roxana, you chose to reveal some of your sources in your book, and that's an unusual choice. And so I want to start with you on this and ask you, why did you make that choice?
So I think it has to do with the fact that I wrote O'Keeffe's biography, and when I wrote that book, I was so careful. I was so conscientious about basing everything on fact and having all the supporting evidence available in footnotes or quoting it from letters. And in this book, I wanted it to be a scholarly document as well as a novel. So, and part of it is schizophrenic. I really couldn't ever make up my mind which I wanted it to be. It turns out to be a novel because I couldn't give up the two great tools of fiction, which are interior monologue and dialogue. And you really can't use those in biography. And I couldn't give those two up because they're so important to creating real fiction, a fictional narrative. But I wanted the book to stand as a biographical document. And so I put in a lot of original material, but partly because I liked their writing. Their letters were quite wonderful, but also because of Dawson's presence as an editor. He wrote so many editorials, and they were part of the history of the South and the history of Charleston, and they were so vivid. So when I was initially doing research, I was able to look through the archives of the Charleston News and Courier all the way back to 1873. So I could scan it and see what Dawson was thinking every day. I could see his editorials, but I also started seeing little articles that were put in, little news breaks that were put in. And I realized everything in the paper was something he wanted people to see. And I started seeing reports of behavior, a lot of violence that he was deliberately putting into the paper. He was deliberately letting his readers understand that lynching was going on or murder. So I became, and those documents, those little brief articles or news breaks were really powerful. And so I wanted to put them in so that the reader would encounter them and understand that was what Dawson was thinking about. That was what was going on at that time. And it seemed to me to be more powerful to put it in Dawson's words and say, this is what was in the paper that day, instead of my saying as the author, violence was increasing in South Carolina during this period, was to put in these original comments in the paper. So for me, it felt more powerful. And with the letters, there were times when I thought I was going to write the whole thing as a novel and I was going to paraphrase, but their letters were really wonderful. So I couldn't give them up. So it's a hybrid.
You fell in love with those letters, didn't you?
I did.
Annette, let me ask you, you mentioned earlier that you discovered that the Grove Park Inn had been used to house these prisoners of war. And I was interested in that because my father was during World War II. He was in a medical unit that housed prisoners of war. So I could really sort of relate to that. But you came to that, and then once you discovered it, can you talk to us a little bit about what kind of what kind of research you then pursued in order to write that novel?
Yeah, sure. As I mentioned, I had not heard that story before. And so it made sense that I hadn't heard that story before because when I went digging for more information, there just wasn't a lot available in terms of the specific experience of those who were at the Grove Park Inn. And that makes some sense, right? It's not like they're allowing reporters onto the grounds to cover the daily life. And so in terms of that's very specific information, the Grove Park Inn has a book on their history that is out that has, maybe about a page and a half of information on what was going on at the Grove Park. Which is, in some ways, because I'm writing fiction, it is a little bit of a blessing because that gives me a little bit more liberty to create the world that I want to create for the narrative. But I did do research, more research in terms of the time period. I use a lot of photographs in terms of my research. I really spend a lot of time going through any photographs of the area, both Cherokee and Asheville, that are available from 1942 or kind of that period of time, because landscape is incredibly important to me. I did, read newspaper articles just to get a sense of the language of what people did know and didn't know about what was going on, because one of the challenges of historical fiction is we know a lot more now about what was happening in 1942 than we would have known in 1942. I was also fortunate that my protagonist was speaking retrospectively, so he could bring some of that in. But in terms of research, I spent a lot of time, again, just looking at photographs and some newspaper articles, and then talking with people who have these stories from their parents, that talk about what it was like during that time period. So it wasn't kind of an archival experience for me. It was more about getting a sense of place and people of that period.
Okay, good. Bobbie Ann, let me ask you. My guess is that you talked to some people that really were out there in California during the 1960s, and had a lot of firsthand knowledge of what was going on out there, at least, or not firsthand, but through your friends, some of your friends who are famous writers here in Kentucky and in the country. Did you mind or dig around in their minds to pull some of these details out in your novel?
I'm sorry. Did I mind what?
Did you dig around in the life stories of your friends who were out there in California at the time of the 60s in order to do your research, or did you do it in another way?
The friends I knew who were in California during the 60s all went to Stanford University on Stegner fellowships in creative writing. And so I heard from them all through the 60s and 70s about the scene in California. Before it became mainstream, or before the countercultural revolution really got going. So that was just in my background that I knew about that. And I suppose I always wondered, well, what if I had gone to California instead of going to the East Coast to graduate school? So when I started writing this novel, I thought, well, it was sort of my question, but then I thought, well, I'll write a novel about a young woman who does go to California. So I started writing about Anne going to Stanford. I had never seen Stanford University and didn't know much about California. But I was writing the novel and I wanted to go to Palo Alto to check it out. and see what kind of landscape I could write. And as it happened, I didn't get a chance to go to Palo Alto. And so I had to make it up. And then I thought, I ended up writing about Anne imagining that she went to California, which made it a much more interesting story, I think, than if I had just written about somebody who went to California. So you're asking about the research.
Yes.
The research, oddly enough, I didn't really do much research. Mainly, I drew from memory because I knew what it was like to be a student in the 60s, a graduate student. And then the main research I did had to do with what Stanford University was like. I studied maps, I studied pictures. I tried to figure out where on campus Anne and her boyfriend Jimmy would be and how long it would take to walk to a certain place. And I had a lot of questions about the trees and the weather. I kept a log for a year of what my the Weather Channel or the weather app told me was the weather in Palo Alto. So because I wanted to know when it would be raining and so on. So my questions were really, what if I had gone to California? What would it have been like? And so I wanted to get that exactly right. The rest of the story, I didn't feel that I had to get it exactly right because it was that conflict between Anne's imagination and her memory. So I wanted to get the Stanford right. And I think that she succeeded much better in imagining Stanford University than she did in imagining an alternate life, the what if, because her real life is what she thinks about.
I want to ask each one of y'all some questions, maybe that are just specific to you and to your work, if you don't mind me doing that. And let's see, Roxana, I think I should rotate back to you. When I read your novel initially, one of the things that really struck me was how deeply flawed that Dawson is. And of course, that makes him an interesting character. Do you think he ever comes to understand that?
You mentioned that before, and so I'm not quite sure which of his flaws you're talking about. I mean, if you mean he was not a perfect liberal, that his feelings about race were deeply flawed, I don't think he ever understood what we would think of as a liberal progressive person today, because he was surrounded by his own times. The rest of him, he was bossy, he was domineering, but he was a loving
The
father.
rest of him, I'm interested in. I'm not really, I wouldn't expect him to have the same exact, views that we have about things. But he is bossy, he is domineering. He's not a thoughtful person in many ways.
Yeah.
And he gets into some serious trouble, of course.
Yeah. So, we never know ourselves as well as the novelists who write about us know us. Anna Karenina will never know herself as well as Tolstoy knows her, and as well as the reader does. So no, Dawson never had this the revelations about himself that would explain much of what he did to himself. That's for the reader to know. He was caught up. I mean, he was an idealist, and he really did feel that he was trying to do the best for Charleston, and that he was right about everything. It's
He
hard
did
for a
have that
writer,
attitude, didn't he?
hard for a writer to imagine, right? He thought- he could, you know, he had the best job in the world. He could write down his opinions every single day and publish them. So, you know, it was kind of a world in which he was never corrected until the very end, when he was corrected very seriously. But no, I don't think he ever understood that he was domineering. But he was an idealist. He thought he was doing things for the best, and in the end, he was corrected by life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I wondered about that because of the title of the book. It implies the fall of a tragic hero, which implies some sort of realization, I think. And so, I've been wanting to ask you about that, and I'm glad I got a chance to do that. Annette, let me ask you a question that came to mind when I was reading your book. You've got your major character, Cowie County, I guess is how you pronounce that, and uh, the young Cherokee woman meeting in this room 447, and County also has a lot of interactions with bears, and you and I know that 4 and 7 are special numbers to Cherokees, and that bears are actually Cherokees, just our lost clan. But most people don't know that. Are there other kind of little Cherokee things you spread out in that novel that you'd like to say something about?
I mean, I think there are probably little nuggets that I don't even realize are specific to Cherokee, because I'm trying to create, this world that is truly a Cherokee world. Definitely the nod to 447 was intentional. And as you mentioned, the bears as well, they're actually two different bears. And just for kind of the audience purposes, bears are, well, as you mentioned, they're kind of the lost clan. They are the most closely related beings to humans for the Cherokee people. And so I wanted to kind of skirt that line of the things that are truly important to our culture, but sometimes get usurped and used in a way that is not authentic to our culture. People will talk about things like spirit animals and things like that.
Don't get me started on that.
And I wanted to almost take the reader there where they're expecting that, and then show the reality of it, that we can respect other creatures in this world other than humans, but that doesn't make us magical, in any way. So I do that a lot. Lishi is an important character for me, and naming her Lishi was important to me because, as I explained in the beginning of the book, Lishi means maternal grandmother, but the character of Lishi was actually County's paternal grandmother. And that allowed me to, again, talk about how we label relationships, and how the character of Lishi was very important to County. And in Cherokee culture, the maternal side, the maternal relationship is the most important in terms of familial bond and family identity. What traditionally clan you would belong to. So playing with her name is something that I think that people pick up on, even if they don't have that context, but I'm not sure they know the extent of why I chose that name. Yeah.
Bobbie Ann, I wanted to ask you too. I think good literature often echoes but doesn't completely parallel past literature. And you make multiple references in Dear Anne to the Romantic poets and to the short lives of Shelley and Keats. And then you have your narrators on a cruise ship. And there are just multiple references to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, how you structured that and why you structured it that way?
Well, Anne and her boyfriend Jimmy are English majors, so they're studying literature. And there's one poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge that is very special to them, Kubla Khan. And this is in 67, 68. When she's on the cruise ship 50 years later and looking at the water, I think memory of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge, water, water everywhere, and never a drop to drink, and the albatross. These, I imagine, provoke her memory and are a motive for trying to launch into this mental exercise of purging her memory of that time. And so the novel is really based on that connection.
Okay.
And so I think that may answer your question.
Yeah, it did. It worked real well, I thought.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you know, being an old English major myself, I like that a good bit. I've got other questions I can ask these people, but do you have questions from the audience? Because I see this.
Yeah.
Is this up here on these screens, or are we supposed to do something about that?
Well, we have a few questions from the audience, but 2 of the 3 that I was going to ask have already been answered, which is amazing, makes my job easier.
Okay.
But I have a question that came to mind as we were talking, because when you're writing historical fiction, you all mentioned research. And I know that research takes a long time, writing takes a long time. So for the people in the audience who are looking to get into writing, or they're already interested in historical fiction, how long did it take for each of you to write your books? And Margaret, if you want to start, even if you want to go back to Maud's Line and talk about that book, I know it's very different for each author, but how long did it take you to write Maud's Line or Cherokee America?
Well, for Maud's Line, this is going to be shocking, and you know, I probably shouldn't say it in public, and especially in front of other writers. It only took me 14 months to write Maud's Line, and that's highly unusual. It's abnormal. It took me probably, including the research, 20 years to write Cherokee America.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, you know, a normal book falls somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I don't know. Shall we ask our guest?
You got
here?
lucky with your first one. You must have been drinking a lot of coffee. Yeah, and Annette, I'm curious to hear from you, because this is your debut novel, right?
Yes, it is. It's not my first novel manuscript, though.
Right.
So my first novel manuscript took, I feel like, a few lifetimes to write. This one, I think the writing took about 3 years, a total of a 4-year process from when I began conceptually to the point that it was on shelves. I think about probably 4 years. Yeah.
Wow.
All right, Roxana, how about you? How long did it take you to write Dawsons Fault?
It took 5 years.
Bobbie, yeah, and I think you said that earlier, didn't you? Bobbie Ann?
Well, it took 6 years, but probably I was working only about 2 years worth out of that. It was very slow, and I meandered around, and I had a lot of different directions I went to get it started. So it shouldn't have taken that long, but I didn't have much focus. So it took as long as it took.
They do. They take as long as they take, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
They really do. Well, let me ask you, did you say that's the the only other one we had from the,
I've got one last one, but
oh, well, I've got 2 or 3 more, but you go
Okay.
ahead.
okay. I'm curious if anyone wants to share. What are you writing next? What are you working on right now?
You want to go for me first and then we'll get them?
Sure.
Okay. I have a book in press that'll come out next October,
Fantastic.
and I will probably be doing some editing on it, but I'm also working on something that I've only been working on about 4 or 5 months now, and I'm not even ready to talk about it yet.
Okay. No spoilers.
Yeah.
No spoilers.
Yeah, well, Lord knows what'll happen to it. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So, what are some of the, Roxana, what are you writing on now? Can you tell
Uh,
us?
No, I don't talk about it when I'm working on it. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
That's
believe
okay.
me, that's what I just said. I can't talk about it. Yeah.
You don't want to jinx it
Yeah.
either.
Well, it's too fragile.
Sure.
All
sure.
right. Bobbie Ann, are you writing on anything you can tell us about?
I haven't been doing much. I want to get back to some stories for a while.
Okay. Some stories. And Annette, how about you?
Yeah, it's really vague right now. I think I'm working on another novel. What I'll say is that I know that it's going to be contemporary fiction and a female protagonist, and I'm really hoping to take some of the themes and values from traditional Cherokee origin stories and use them to frame a modern context that's gonna explore the intersection between tribal politics and some traditional, like modern tribal politics and Cherokee cultural values. I know that sounds really vague and weird, but
Well, to me, actually.
so that's what I'm doing. There's I know I didn't say any kind of plot there, but yeah,
Well,
it's kind of vague right now.
kind of vague. All right. How much more time have we got? Have we got time for another question?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. One of the real challenges of writing historical fiction is to get the dialogue true to the era of your characters, but also make it understandable and not offensive to modern readers. Can somebody just jump in and talk about the choices that you make in trying to do that, and how you do it?
Well, I always want the language to be as accurate as possible, as close to the time period or the region or the world that the people are talking out of. And that's one of the, just working with words is one of my great pleasures in doing that. So I want the words to be right. It bothers me when I see movies or TV shows that use the language, use contemporary language for a period piece. Like for a time, you'd watch Jane Austen movies or similar things, and the characters would always come into a room and say, "So," which is a thing that's more contemporary to us. I doubt if they had that intonation then. And so things like that bother me, and especially the liberal sprinkling of the F word in historical situations where I really doubt that it was sprinkled.
Mm-hmm. 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 Roxana, how about you?
So like Bobbie Ann, I think for me, it's really, really important that dialogue sound authentic. And it's one thing that always made me feel I never would write historical fiction because I was not sure I could get it right. So with this, I thought about it a lot, and I thought about Jane Austen and Trollope for example, whose language is much more vernacular and informal than we sort of think of it as being, partly because of those awful movies have been made with people in hoop skirts and stilted language. But there is a lot of informality in the 19th century books. But I also, my model, well, I had two models actually. One was Michael Cunningham's The Hours, in which he successfully sort of channeled the voice of Virginia Woolf, and there was dialogue in his book that seemed to be coming straight from Virginia Woolf and her sister, for example. And I was just mesmerized by the fact that he seemed to be speaking in those voices from that period. And the other model was Hilary Mantel, whose book Wolf Hall I practically memorized while I was writing this book. I would read 3 or 4 pages of it before I would start writing every day to remind myself of how it was possible to immerse yourself in a period and to be able to reproduce it. Not reproduce it, actually, that sounds inauthentic, but to find yourself in that period and be able to describe it, and particularly the dialogue. And I became sort of a fan, of a groupie of Hilary Mantel, and she came to New York for the production of her play. And I met her once at a literary event. And I said to her, this is what she really wants to talk about, a huge literary event. But I came up and said, how did you do the dialogue? How did you manage that? It's just impossible, because the dialogue in those books is so contemporary. It's so real. It's brief, it's informal, it's intimate, it's thoughtful. And of course, she didn't really answer, because you can't ever tell anybody how you write, because you can't. But what she said was also fascinating. She said, you know, the people in those books are before Shakespeare. So we had to, she had to search for documents that gave her a sense of unwritten language. All we have is written language to tell us how people talked about then. But she needed to give a sense of spoken language through written documents. Anyway, she said she had to go back before Shakespeare to find it.
And that would mean she would have to take all the little things of Shakespeare that we now don't even know belong to Shakespeare out.
Yeah.
So that those characters don't say those things.
Right.
Oh God, that's fascinating. It's fascinating.
It is. Yeah.
And all right, do we have, where are we here? I can't.
Well, it's about 8 o'clock. So I suppose it's about time for us to wrap up. Do you have any other questions?
Well, let's see. I got the. Did I get the I got the language thing from. Oh no, I didn't get it from Annette. Do we have time to get it from Annette?
Oh yeah,
okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Annette, let me ask you. You're having these people in 1940s in Appalachia speak actually standard English rather than Southern mountain speech, which is, I believe, what they really spoke. You must have made a choice about that. And can you tell us why you made that choice?
Sure. I always make a choice about I pay a lot of attention to dialogue, especially in the revision process. It kind of gets out of hand in the draft process, but I'd gotten some really good advice one time in terms of dialect and dialogue, in that you should give a reader enough to give them a sense of place and culture, but not overwhelm what's being said with these little cues to dialect. So there are examples in the book where certain words are used, or pronunciations of words, but I didn't want that to overwhelm specifically the protagonist County, what he is saying, because he's speaking retrospectively. So his language actually changes from the perspective of 19-year-old until he is an elder when he's telling the story. So his level of education, vocabulary is retrospective. So I wanted to make sure that that was conveyed. And then, and that, Margaret, I'm sure that you are on the same page as this. I will never have a native speaker speaking in broken English. I will, I refuse. And I think that still people think that, you know, Cherokees in the 1940s, maybe even in 2020, still have some kind of broken English, and they don't. You know, when I listen to some of our elders speak, those who, you know, were around in 1942, or their parents were, it's not as starkly different than, you know, other communities in Appalachia. So I just want to pepper the dialogue with enough to give a sense of place, but not overwhelm what's actually being said.
Okay, yeah, yeah, that's a hard thing to do if you're writing with people that are not people are not speaking the standard English. They're speaking some sort of dialect. You've got to make those choices, and they're really serious choices.
Mhm.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Margaret, for being our hostess
Well,
and
it's nice
asking
to
these
see.
questions.
It's nice to see these people. I haven't seen Roxana in I don't know how long. I was hoping to see her in person. I've seen Bobbie Ann more recently, and I've just met Annette.
Well,
so it's been a nice night for me.
We hope that in 2021 we're able to do this in person, not 6 feet apart, but
yeah.
Anyway, thanks to technology, we were able to get these authors to speak with us about their fantastic work. So I want to say thank you to Roxana, Bobbie Ann, Annette, and Margaret for their insights, and to our sponsor, the Kim Edwards Charitable Foundation, for making this event possible. We also want to thank you, wherever you are, for joining us for this 2020 Kentucky Book Festival online event. If you're interested in purchasing one of the books discussed today, please visit our independent bookstore partner, Joseph Beth Booksellers, at josephbeth.com. For a complete schedule of Kentucky Book Festival conversations, visit kyhumanities.org and follow us on social media at kyhumanities. For Kentucky Humanities, I'm Sarah Woods.